What if you are present, abundant, and mindful when it comes to the design of your legacy? I'd like to welcome Martin Salama to the Design Your Legacy podcast this lovely day. Welcome, Martin.
Thank you, Angelina. I'm excited to be here with you.
It's my pleasure to host you. And are you joining from New York City or where are you joining this lovely day?
I'm in Brooklyn, New York.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah.
So I thought we might start with the problem and then we'll get to the remedy. And I thought one of the problems was you had talked about this idea of shifting from worry to abundance, or this idea of not drowning from anxiety or anger. And I know you talked about the path that you've had as an entrepreneur and whether that was like the founding of a gym and the $15 million capital raise, et cetera. But would you start with what you see today as a problem? And the reason I bring this up is if somebody's mindset is in fear, it's very hard to design a legacy. But if they can be in a calm place of a growth mindset, then they can have the creative juices going to then say, you know what, I can plan a legacy because they're not in survival brain. So where
Right.
would you like to start the listeners this lovely day?
Wow. Boy, you've opened up the world for me there. Wow. So for me, I really do. I go back to 2008 where I lost all that money that you mentioned, but we could even go further back. We could go back to an episode, to a time in my life where I look at it as a defining moment that really changed my life at that moment when I was 10 years old, believe it or not. When I was
Was this
10 years old,
was this when your brother passed?
yeah,
Okay, please go on. Please go on.
yeah. So when I was 10 years old, we had a tragedy in my family. And as you said, my brother was killed by a school bus. And it was just a terrible day. I live it very often, almost every day. Pretty much every day I think of my brother in some way, shape, or form. And for many, many years, it was in a way where it would tense me up, as you talked about anxiety and being anxious and fear and anger. Uh, and then it took me understanding how that shaped me at 10 in a way that I had no idea that it was doing, of course, to look back real. And I talk about defining moments as moments when you can look back in your life and say, I made a decision that defined the next part of my life for however long that might be. And for me, at that moment, when my brother was killed, I have four older sisters. Okay. So I was the first boy. I was 10, and my brother Michael was 5. So when he was born, I was excited. Oh, that's it. I've got my partner in crime. We're gonna set the world on fire together. Right. So and I come from a Jewish family,
You share that
uh,
Sephardic?
Sephardic Jewish, right?
Yes.
And the idea of being able to have someone else that can help me carry the load of carrying the name, carrying the legacy, as you say, was fantastic. The beauty that we can both grow the family, grow the name. And then when he passed, it told me, okay, I have to change. I have to think of things differently. I've lost my best friend. I've lost the guy that I was going to be spending the rest of my life building the world, building myself, building our families, and all that. And what I told myself, nobody said this to me. I was 10. What I told myself was that I have to make sure to always make my parents happy because they've felt the despair.
Yeah, I wondered about that. And again, I realize I'm interrupting you. So if I'm stepping on any toes, just tell me and I'll
It's
give you
all
some
good.
more space.
It's
But I
all
thought
good.
it was so interesting because you almost felt responsible for everyone's happiness. And I thought that's a lot to put on a 10 years old, somebody who's 10. But also I think a lot of times families and individuals don't necessarily have the coping skills unless they've gone through something. But if it's the first time that tragedy has landed on the doorstep, they might not have that coping skill. And what does the 10-year-old do other than say, I just want mom and dad to be happy? And therefore, they're not going to have vocabulary like codependency or anything. They're 10 years old. They're like, I just want everyone to not have the sorrow or the stages of grief on their face.
Right. And don't forget, this was the early 70s, 1973. Okay. So, psychotherapy being, all that was still growing. It wasn't at
Yeah.
a stage where it was so accepted. So much so that we as a family didn't discuss our feelings, what happened for many, many years later. Right? It
I
actually
bet,
took
yeah.
almost it actually took almost 20 years before my sisters and I sat in the room and discussed it.
Because it was still so fresh and so painful,
Very
so
painful.
raw.
Right. So I didn't at that moment say it's my job to help everybody. My mindset was I have to make my parents happy. What came of that was that it morphed itself into me becoming a people pleaser.
Yeah. The other thing I wondered about was if there was also this idea around perfectionism. Like I had this pressure, I've got to get it all right. Because then when you went into business, it was like that same pressure was put on your shoulders that you didn't give yourself breathing room.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And when I got married, it was the same thing. My pressure to make sure that she was always happy.
Yeah. I listened to that part and I thought, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then balancing, how do I make my parents happy? How do I make my wife happy? How do I make my children happy and make sure that everybody's happy?
Yeah.
You
And
know?
where is Martin in all of that? Like Martin's like
Right.
in fourth place. Yeah. Because the other
At
thing,
best.
yeah. And the other thing I thought about, like when you talked about this idea of anger, the anger comes from the pressure cooker because of the perfectionist. You got to get everything right. But I think the anger is also like you've got this whole inner world that hasn't been sorted yet in that rite of passage. And then sometimes anger is the only thing that shows up because you don't yet have like language to say, like, I feel sad.
Right. Exactly. And I believe much anger comes from fear itself.
Sure. What if this tragedy happens again?
Right. In anything that's going on, when you're starting to feel fear, your defense mechanism for me and for many that I coached is go into anger mode,
Yeah.
right? Because it's almost like putting up a shield around you saying, okay, deflection. Let me deflect it by being angry.
Yeah, yeah, which is like the lower part of our brain where the reptilian part is versus the upper part where the creativity is. Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
exactly. So, it took many, many years for me to recognize who I was. And, now we can fast forward to 2008. My wife and I were working on a project for 5 years to build a multi-million dollar, $15 million project. And the funny thing is where that even came from. In the early 2000s, 2002, 2003, I'd opened a business, closed a business, whatever. And I didn't know what I wanted to do next. I really did. My wife came to me and she said, well, you got to think about what you want to do next. And I've been playing tennis. We lived in New Jersey at the time. She goes, and I've taken tennis lessons, and the only times I can play is 9, 10 o'clock at night. There's not enough courts. So maybe
Mm,
we should look to open up a tennis center.
because
And
there's a
the
void,
ironic thing is, Angelina, is I'm not an athlete.
but there was a void in the marketplace and you saw it.
Right.
Yeah, and
Right.
supply and demand.
Right. So we did some research and we did that. But what was the underlying thing was me wanting to please my wife.
Oh, which is so ironic because you had shared in prior podcasts that you would yell at her, but she never knew that she was like your gold.
Right. Right. Yes. Yes. I think about it now. There were times where I would sit and lecture her because, and she would just take it all in. Now, I was to blame. She was to blame. We were both to blame for what the positives and the negatives in our marriage. We were to credit and to blame. And that was my way of communicating was that if she was going to be quiet, I was just going to keep talking and keep talking, and keep talking, whether it was a yelling, to me, that was my defense. That was my default tendency was it could be fear, it could be whatever that I would get to the anger stage, right? And I would yell and I would like, okay, you got it. That's it. And I would lecture.
Well, I think it was also a way for maybe for you 1% to feel in control. And
Yeah,
yet,
definitely.
yeah, because you wanted to make it all wonderful and perfect and her to be happy. And yet, I mean, $15 million, I mean, I know you had shared you borrowed funds from different individuals, whether it was family members, friends, associates. And now there's that, with debt comes like these invisible strings that can keep one awake at night because can I pay
Right.
them back? How am I going to pay them back? And
Exactly.
it's a lot different when there's no debt and one can be financially independent or on another side of the ledger where they've got assets working for them. So now it's like you find yourself underneath again this pressure and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I'm
Yeah,
glad
it was it was pretty daunting,
yeah, well I'm
to
glad that
say
you
the
broke
least.
the pattern because I heard the story about you didn't pay your insurance and you tripped.
That's right. I stopped paying my car insurance, my car payments, my house payments. And event one day, I looked outside. My son said, "Look outside." They were towing away my BMW. It was repossessed. Crazy. And then the house ended up getting foreclosed on. I guess we were lucky. We lived in New Jersey, and there were so many foreclosures that it took them years until they finally acted on it.
Interesting. So I bring up the starting stage of your life's journey because you've published a book about mindset, but it
Mhm.
wasn't just, something that ChatGPT wrote. It was something that you lived, like you went through each like chapter of your life in a sense to like turn over every stone and say, okay, what happened there? What was I really thinking there? Was my self-worth really intact, or was I conditioned? But no one ever like lifted up their head to say, where did all this conditioning come from? And am
Right.
I being in choice?
Right. Exactly right. And so many people who have read the book have come to me, people that have known me well, and said, "Boy, you get very vulnerable, very raw in that book." I'm like, "Well, yeah. How can I show people I can help them if they don't understand that I've been down that road and
Yeah,
that I understand who they are and what they're trying to do? They're just different people with different roads, but similar journeys."
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I thought it was so interesting. If I go to that part where, sometimes when it rains, it pours. So you would come to this place where not only was life tough, but then you tripped. And then after you tripped, I think that's when you still have that hunger to want to be successful. And you went to the coaching program, and the gentleman who organized it said, "Well, you can come, but I will only give you the certificate, after you sort through the payment plan." But you were hungry enough that you said, "If I have to ride my bicycle, I will get there." And I was reminded of, I know about Tony Robbins because he comes from Los Angeles, but he wasn't the big deal when he first started out. He
Right.
was struggling. He came from a dysfunctional family of I think three or four different fathers, and his mother I think was both an alcoholic, but she was also a drug addict, and she would attack him. And yet he was so determined to study underneath Jim Rohn that it was like he begged, borrowed, and stealed and got a loan from the lady at the bank that was not, it
Right.
was her money. It wasn't even the bank's money. But then you look at where he is
Wow.
today because he made those sacrifices and those choices because he was so hungry to be successful. He said, I'm not going to just settle. And I
Mhm.
think in your own life, you said, okay, well, tragedy's shown up on my doorstep, not once, but twice. How do I build from this?
Yeah, exactly right. And when I sat down with that CFO of the coaching company, coaching school I went to, I said, "Look, I know I can't pay for it. I know that I won't get approved for financing because my credit is in the crapper.
Which is so
Because of
great that
a,
you're speaking about that because how many other Americans are in debt? How many other Americans were in those same exact shoes, but their
exactly
shame clouded their confidence?
right, exactly." So I said to him, "Let's come up with a payment plan, whatever we could come up with, and I promise that I'll make that payment every month, whether it's a 2 year, five, whatever the number is." We
Hmm.
came up with a number, and then he said to me, "This is all good, but for you to get your certification, you have to be paid off." And I'm like, "Well, that's fair.
Hmm.
I could easily get my certification, and it's not my style, but it could be other people's styles. They go, now that I have the certification, I don't have to pay anymore."
Yeah.
I was like, "Yeah, that makes sense. It's all fair, and let's do that." And I
Yeah.
paid into I was able to get my certification maybe a month or two after the rest of my classmates did. Who cares?
Yeah. Well, I think it's wonderful. So let me then pivot for a moment to the Warrior's Life Code. And I
Mhm.
wondered, how did you go from worry and lack to now being in a place where you're more at peace? Because there's a lot of founders and entrepreneurs that are working 12-hour days, are putting themselves last. And I know that that I think you're asking yourself different questions, but walk the listener through how you went from being reactive to now finding yourself with choice. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Yes, I muted myself because there was a little noise in the background.
Okay, okay.
So yeah, so that's a great question, and I'd love to say that it happened overnight. A lot of it started with what we talked about earlier about me understanding who I was, who my wife was, and what needed to change. Right as I went through things, and as I understood going through coach training and learning about the things that had been holding me back for many years because I was making them hold me back. Okay.
Mm.
And me accepting that it's in my mind, it's up to me to decide how to move forward, how I'm reacting instead of responding. And that came out of doing the work. The work was me understanding I was a people pleaser. Now I call myself a recovering people pleaser. You know, just like an addict, I can easily fall back into people pleasing because it was my nature. It wasn't even my second nature. It was my nature. And with that came all these other things that are like layers of onions. Okay.
Mm.
That I took things personally, that I needed to be in control because if I was going to people please, it had to be under my rules. I needed to make sure that people were recognizing me for the work that I was doing. I needed that recognition, that admiration. And when all those things weren't happening, my default would be to lose my temper.
Yeah, it's
So I had
interesting.
to realize that.
Yeah. Were your parents people pleasers or your family?
Um, no,
Okay.
no, no. To think about it, nobody ever asked me that question before, and I never really thought about it. But my gut instinct is no, they weren't.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Just curious. Because
Yeah,
sometimes if they're modeling it before we find other role models in life, we go,
right.
okay, well, that's how, you know, I need to be because that's what I've seen. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I think my gut reaction is no. They were great community minded people who
Okay.
helped and were of service. But I don't know. I wouldn't call them people pleasers. Especially my dad. My dad would always make sure that he was taken care of first, not at any negatives to us.
Okay.
But he was. He had a certain self confidence that way.
Well, I think he was also an entrepreneur because you helped him out
Yeah,
going,
yeah, he was.
which is those are some very sweet stories.
Yeah, he really was.
Yeah.
Remembering my dad as I grew up, we didn't call ourselves entrepreneurs back then. We were businessmen.
Okay.
You
Okay.
know, but he had a factory. And every day he would be the first one in the factory. He'd open the door. And when by the time all the workers came in, and there were over 100 workers, he would be, the doors would open about 8:30. And by about 9, he was walking the floor,
Mm.
saying good morning to every person in the factory.
Yeah, you
And
spoke of
every day, yeah, he would stop by somebody else and talk to them and connect with them.
yeah, you spoke of his humanity, and I thought, I wonder if that was his legacy.
It was definitely part of his legacy. It was definitely a big part of his legacy. There are others as well, but that's a big part. It's a legacy he passed on to me. He was never a boss. He was a leader.
And he loved people,
Loved people.
and you
And
get to
people
love
loved
people
him.
now.
People loved him. He actually, after he sold his factory to his partner, he opened up the first, no, it wasn't the first, but it was the first well established flea market indoors in New York and came up with great rules that had to happen. Very often in flea markets, people come and go, the vendors come and go, and they want to be there for Christmas and they don't want to be there in the summer and whatever. And he established like, okay, you want to be here, you get a 1 year lease starting in September. If you come in, if you come in April, your lease is till September, and then it's really renewed for a year. And every day of the week, they were usually Friday, Saturday, Sunday was when the flea market was open. And when Christmas time was open every day, he would walk the floors of the flea market and talk to the vendors. And they loved him. He was the mayor of the place.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's important. And also the fact that you were exposed to that and could watch it.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
it,
he
it,
was,
it served me in many ways as I grew up, as I established myself in New Jersey and realized there wasn't a synagogue close enough to my home
okay.
that we needed to build one. I was the leader of the synagogue. I was the founder. And I'm very proud to say there's over 400 families in that. And about a year ago, they established, they're expanding. The rabbi called me and invited me to come to the expansion ceremony and was very gracious, got up there and talk about vision. Nobody saw what's now, except for Martin. And it was my father teaching me about vision, about leadership that got me to there.
Oh, that's wonderful. And to be equal opportunity, tell me about your mother's legacy.
Oh, I could. So my mother's father was a rabbi,
Okay.
and she had 12 sisters and brothers. My mother, and she
Okay.
was one of the youngest ones. So she was always around a family with many people and understood the community, the family dynamic, and the need to keep the family together. In my Jewish community, very few people leave the New York, New Jersey area.
You
We
mentioned
don't.
that, like in that, whether it was Brooklyn, yeah, that community.
Right.
Yeah.
So and never we looking back now, it's unbelievable her strength because when my brother Michael died, for a few months she was inconsolable. Understandable. She lost her baby. Right. And but she finally somebody came to her and said, there are a couple of other women who recently have lost children as well. We'd love to get
Oh,
you together so
yeah.
that you have each other to talk with because nobody could say to them what anybody else could say was, I know how you feel. So they started going and they had a counselor come in and help them. Again, this was the early 70s. And they understood, my mother especially understood the importance of this group. And when women would lose children in the community, she would go out and tell them about the group, this support group. And there's an interesting story. My mother barely ever talked about my brother, barely ever talked about this group. But one day, I would say it's about 20 years ago, I was in my late 30s, early 40s. She called me up and she said, remember this girl you dated, an Ashkenazi girl, actually, who was from Long Island when you were in your early 20s? I said, yeah, of course. She goes, well, she lost her brother. Her brother was killed by a drunk driver, and her mother found her way to our group. And she mentioned to me that her daughter has been struggling. Martin, I want you to call her up and take her out for lunch. I go, okay. Called her up. We went out for lunch and I told her, I know how you feel. So it was my mother's teaching training. And a few years ago, a woman came up to me who I've known for many years, who lost a daughter, who said to me, your mother saved my life.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that outreach is so important. And sometimes the outreach has to be proactive because the party that is hurting might not ask because they're too numb.
Exactly. Exactly. And that was the case my mother felt like she needed to give back for the people who were there for her to pass it along, to pay it forward.
Mm, that's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing
Yeah.
that.
Thank
So
you.
if I go back to the idea of transitioning from worry and anxiety to this place of
Yeah.
peace, what are some of the questions that you're asking yourself that are different today than they were 10, 20, 30 years ago?
Ah, so very often my answers often would be, I can't. To whatever the question was, I would automatically go to this mindset of lack, this mindset of complaining, problems. And I started to learn through going through coach training that you have to change your mindset from the I have to I want to, or I don't want to. I choose to or I choose not to. And take out the I can't to I choose not to, but really move it along and say, how can I?
Yeah, that's so interesting. So to say that I can't is the limiting beliefs.
Exactly.
Yeah, many
Exactly.
people,
And as soon as you say that, you close yourself off.
yeah, many people, they're not ready to look at their limiting beliefs.
No, no, because it's a defense mechanism. It's a way of them saying, well, but I look at them as a that they're rationalizing. And I believe that the word rationalize is really two words: rational lies. That you tell yourself a lie that it's rational for me not to do something or to do something that goes against my core belief, my core value.
Hmm.
So you say it's rational because I'll be helping this person or whatever. But at the end of the day, you're just lying to yourself and you're giving yourself you're a cop out. It's a way of copping out.
Yeah, well, thank you for calling it out as an excuse.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
now
one
that
of
once you hear that, you it gives you the idea to say to yourself, is it the truth or is it a rational lie that I'm telling myself? And then the
well,
consequences go from there.
yeah, that's very courageous that you're saying that, that you're sharing that. Because a lot of times, and you probably know this in coaching, people will lie to others about specific topics because they're already lying to themselves.
Exactly. It's become a truth for them.
Yeah. Yeah. But you put them in the sea of vulnerability, though, when you take out the microscope and the
Right,
light.
exactly. And in the coaching space, it's even better because number one, the coach is supportive. Number
Yeah.
two, they're objective, right? So there's no judgment there. And number three, they can be an accountability partner.
Which is what I think is needed today. Because if we don't have people that call out our limiting beliefs or our BS, it's just another decade on the mouse wheel.
Yeah, exactly right.
And people can be living lives of silent desperation and they just fall through the cracks.
Yep.
Yeah. What else would you like to share about your self transformation?
So thank you. So for me, it's always been once I understood that if you stand still, you're going backwards or you're dying, that you always have to be reinventing yourself, moving forward. So I originally, when I finished coaching training, I became a divorce recovery coach. I just come through a divorce. I understood what it took. And I was going to help, I helped people, you know, navigate, recover from the emotional pains of divorce and understand the emotional feelings that they had to help them get through that. But as I grew myself, I realized there was more I could give to more people. And I started doing things that I'd never done before. I'm ADHD, so I was doing things like meditating, you know. And could you imagine an ADHD guy meditating? It's like my head is all over the place. How does somebody stay calm, right? And I would do even guided meditation. And one of these days, I was doing a guided meditation, and I had this download of information that I was loving my life, and I wanted to share that with others. So after my 10-minute meditation, I wrote for about 2 hours. And out of that came this acronym for life, which to me stands for live incredibly full every day. Right. And then I took it, I said, what does that mean? What does that look like? And it
Mm,
means I want to be happy, which is self love, self care, which is very important to the people pleaser side.
yeah.
Right. But
Yeah.
also, I want it to be meaningful. I want it to be selfless. That doesn't mean people please. That means what are you doing for yourself, happiness, and what are you doing for others that may help them? So I could look back. Part of my legacy is the synagogue I built, which is named after my brother, which my dad gave us the first seed money to be able to do that. And he turned to me and
Mm.
I said, Dad, we're going to start looking for a place to build. He said, I'll give you $50,000 if you name it after your brother. And that was basically one of the only times we talked about my brother.
That's so sweet and so constructive.
Yeah.
Yeah. What I appreciate right now is how intentional you are about your decisions, that you're not just going through your days. Because I do see people sometimes that if they aren't happy in life, they're just like racing to the end of their life.
Right, exactly. And it's interesting when you bring up legacy, it brings up so much stuff for me. And it made me think 2 years ago was the 50th anniversary of my brother's passing. And we have a tradition in my synagogue that you donate a lunch or a breakfast or something in memory of somebody or in honor of somebody. And my rabbi takes it to the next level. And he says, it's not enough for you to just donate it and say, oh, this is for Michael or whatever. He says, or for your father or whatever. My father's been gone for over 20 years now. He said, you got to get up and talk about the person so that people could connect with you and understand what this breakfast means to you. So when it was on the 50th, I got up there and I talked about it. And I said, a couple of weeks earlier, I was talking to one of my sisters and she said, what if Michael had lived? I said, I stopped playing the what if game a long time ago because I was in that what if world for so many times, so many years. And finally, I realized I can't do a what if because it'll never come true, number one. But
Hmm.
number two, why don't we look at, and this was me taking it to the next level and speaking to the audience that day, why don't we look at what happened, what the impact a 5-year-old boy had on his family and on the community? So I said, okay, Let's look at it. My mother, we talked about the things that she did, the leader she became, right? And a few years ago, they published a book in our community called Legends. And it was this woman who's a fantastic photographer taking pictures of the seniors in our community and writing about their lives. And one of the things my mother's quote was, God gave me great big shoulders because God knew I had a lot to carry.
Mm, mm.
And so that was my mother's legacy. And it will be, continues to be my mother's legacy. This community, this supportive group that's out there for women. My mom these days is 92, almost 93. She's got dementia. She's not everything she was, but her legacy is there and we know it. And her grandchildren and her great grandchildren, I'm very glad to say her great great grandchildren know it as well. Okay.
Oh,
So that's my mother. My dad,
I
my
just want to
dad was,
interrupt for a second. I just want to interrupt for a second. I think these are the stories that need to be shared. Please
yeah,
continue and go on.
yes, thank you. So my dad was always a community leader as well. And he was part of the synagogues and all that. And he got involved in the synagogue where we were. And he watched as his mother had a stroke and had to go into a nursing home and passed in the nursing home. And it bothered him. And he, along with a couple of other leaders in that synagogue, came up with the idea of buying some apartment buildings and transforming them into senior citizens apartments, kind of like assisted living, but they don't need so much assistance. And it became communal. The seniors of our community lived in those buildings, still do. And, he that's one of the things he's done. So he's done that. I could look when a few years after my brother passed, a long time, maybe 20 years, 30 years, I was at my one of my cousins is one of the foremost neurologists on the pediatric neurologist on the East Coast. And I took one of my sons there because ends up he had ADHD. And he said, Martin, do you know why I became a neurologist? I said, no, I know you always wanted to be a doctor. He goes, no, I became a pediatric neurologist because of your brother. He said, your brother had brain damage. And if he had survived, who knows what would have happened with him? Because it took him a few days before he passed. He said, I decided at that moment to become a pediatric neurologist. So my sister is something there should be more of her in the world. Now, as a sister, she's a tough girl. She's my sister. But in the outside world, she's unbelievable. And her and her husband have been involved in doing kindness, what we call chesed in our community for many years. And in the 90s, while her father-in-law, and my father would be in the hospital a lot, they were getting older.
Or maybe she
She
could be called a
came,
menschie.
sorry?
I think another word is menschie.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
She started to become their patient advocate. And it wasn't even a word back then, right? She would ask the questions of the doctors. She would have all the notes. She realized that this was something that was missing in our community. So she started to put together an organization within another organization for people to come to her and say, I need a doctor to do for this. Do you know a doctor? And she started to build her Rolodex, her phone book of doctors. And she went back to school. She became a social worker. She also became a chapel so she could walk into a hospital at any time. And from that, she started to go in and tell people, oh, this is what you do. And from that, she realized the greatest need is for cancer patients, for the cancer families. So she started a cancer center in here for number one, when somebody finds out they have cancer, they come to her and she tells them where to go to get the best treatment. But then she built an organization for support for the cancer person, for support for the people that are in the family unit that need it. Her husband, back in 1974, they weren't married. He was the leading to write something in the community, something we use on one of the holidays. And he decided, my brother just passed away, he would dedicate it in memory of my brother. They weren't even dating. They didn't even know each other. That's the legacy this 4-year-old, 5-year-old boy left. My sisters are all involved in different ways. My parents, myself, all I say as a result of the loss of a 5-year-old boy. So his legacy was left in many different ways.
Well, I
And
love
my
that.
legacy is his legacy.
Yeah, I love that good came out of it. Yeah,
Yes.
because humans are meaning making machines. And I love that it was a good meaning that came out of it.
Yeah.
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 Thank you. I'm going to
Thank you.
ask you
Thank
about
you.
your hardcover coffee table book in a moment, but I think that
Okay.
all of this, needs to be in there and should be in there along with like the other defining moments of your life.
Yeah. Many
Yeah.
of them are. Many of them are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes when, they talk about like those darkest moments and how do you build from those darkest moments that where it seems the bleakest, where it feels like the rug just got yanked out from under you. Like
Right.
how do you turn that into creative energy that then is in service to others compared to becoming a black hole in life? Because sometimes people come across tragedy and their lives become a black hole of
Yeah.
self-pity, of, that fear that can turn into rage.
Yep.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
And for many years, I was in that in different ways. Maybe not. Maybe my rage came from that. Maybe my anger came from that. The way
Why
I
was it taken
reacted.
away? Why was Michael taken away?
Right. Exactly. Exactly. And for many years, when someone, my name is Martin. His name is Michael. People that knew me or didn't know me would call me Michael. Right.
Oh,
And for many times, I would tense up. And then as I went
because
through
it's a
coaching,
trigger. It's an emotional trigger.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But as I grew within myself, I realized, you know what? I'm looking at it the wrong way. I'm looking at it as something like that. And instead, now I look at it as, you know what? It's either God or my brother telling me I'm with you
I was going to ask you that question if you've ever felt Michael's presence.
in different ways. Yeah. And it's interesting. A few years ago, I was being coached by a woman who writes unbelievable books. Her name is Genevieve Davis. She writes these books on magic. I don't know if you've ever heard of her.
No, but I'm happy to check her out.
She's called Becoming Magic. And
Okay.
one day I was on her email list and she put out there that I think I want to start coaching a little bit. She wrote. I was like, oh, there's some things I would love to learn from her, from what I've learned through her techniques that I would like to get further. So I reached out and I sent an email and I got lucky to be one of the 10 or 11 that she chose to coach. And the price was like ridiculously low. But we had a conversation one day and she said, tell me about something that holds you back, something that makes you upset. And I want you to think about a way of reframing it and thinking about it in a different way. Don't discuss it with anybody. Don't do it. I just want it to be something you're thinking about. And it took me a while to grasp the concept of what she was talking about. And finally, I understood it was magic words and how to use them and change
Mm,
it, change the story. So at the time, this was 2020, before COVID happened,
mm.
2019 into 2020. And I was telling her about how my ex wife thinks of me as the devil incarnate.
Well, I was wondering if you're friends with your ex-wife today because you've
Well,
known
these
now.
days we have a good relationship.
Good,
And
good.
this is part of how that happened.
Okay.
So she thinks of me the devil incarnate. She talks bad about me to the children. I never say a bad word about her. I could tell them stories. I don't tell them anything,
Sometimes
so
that
on
can
and
be a
so on.
cry for attention also, but keep going.
Yeah, it probably is, but that's besides the point. So she said, why don't you reframe that? Why don't you talk about it? And I thought about it and it took me a couple of sessions to grasp it. And I started saying to myself, you know what? She's got a lot with our youngest daughter, who's on the spectrum, high on the spectrum, very high functioning, but on the spectrum. And there's a lot to deal with there and all that. And she's doing the best she can. That's all I did. I said it to myself. And for the 6, 8 months before that, every time I had a conversation with my daughter, it would be one word answers. How's things?
Mm,
Fine. What's going on? Nothing. So all I did was think this. And about a week or so later, I called my daughter, who lives with her mom at the time, and we had a 45-minute engaging conversation. Now, most people will say that's coincidence. Genevieve says that's the magic starting to happen.
yes, yes.
Right?
Yeah, those
So
are
I
the
embraced
moments
it.
that are ordinary that become extraordinary.
Right. So I embraced it. And I said to my daughter, Claire, I said, Claire, I would love it if we can see each other. She was living over an hour away from me.
Okay.
So could we spend some time together? And she was open to it. So I would go every week, every other week, and we'd spend a few hours together. And we were starting to build our relationship back again. And one time, as I got to the house and waiting for Claire to be ready, Nadine, my ex, said to me, you know, when she comes home, she just shuts herself out and she's good for you. And then she's not good for me. I was like, oh, okay. I said, well, I'll try to talk to her about it. So when I was with Claire, I mentioned to her, you know, I appreciate that you give me your role, but when you go home, and I just left it at that. And I told Nadine, my ex, to call me after I leave so that we're not talking in front of Claire and out of earshot because I wanted to tell her something. So she called me and I said, first thing is I want to say, I recognize the tasks that you have taking care of Claire and it doesn't go unnoticed.
Mm.
And that opened the door and we spoke for the next hour. It was like opening the floodgates.
It was
And
acknowledgement.
yes.
Yeah.
And it changed my relationship with my daughter. It changed my relationship with my ex-wife, and in the long run, with my other children as well. But now here comes COVID. Everything shuts down. I can't go visit her that way. I wasn't
Mm-hmm.
allowed.
Mm-hmm.
By the summer, things had started to loosen up, and I called my ex and I called the therapist, my daughter's therapist. I said I wanted to come stay by me in New Jersey for a week. Ended up being 2 weeks. And it was a really good thing. My ex got some break from her. And a few weeks later, I called her. I said, let's try to do it. She says, I'll let you know. The next day she called me. 2 days later, she called me. She said, come get her now. Because if you don't, either she or I will literally be dead.
The passion is high.
Like, okay. I dropped what I was doing. I drove an hour and a half to Westchester, New York from down by the Jersey Shore, picked up my daughter, and she stayed with us for 7 months.
Mm.
And that helped her. She was now back around a family dynamic, my new wife and her children, and that brought her a long way. But here's the interesting thing.
I
And
wonder if
this
those
is
were
what
the
I was getting
teenage
to.
years, but keep going.
Yeah. Here's the interesting thing. Because I had been sharing with Genevieve the progress before this, back in March, April, May, when it was still just the beginning of it, she said, I'm writing a book. Would it be okay if I put in the book your transformation with your ex-wife and your daughter, and I'll change the names? I'm like, yeah, go ahead. She sends me the book. I open the book, and my name is Michael.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Did she know?
No.
Oh.
I texted her. I said, we need to talk right away. She lives in England. We get on a Zoom call and I tell her the story. She goes, I just always saw you as a Michael.
Interesting. Interesting.
We cried of happiness together. It was a beautiful thing,
Life is ironic sometimes. Was he
isn't
sensitive?
it? It's hard to say. He was only 5 and my memories of him are not great.
Okay. Okay.
He kids, everybody loved him. He was just that type of a kid. Everybody loved him.
Sweet kid. Good.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that story. Since
Yeah.
this is a legacy podcast, what does this word legacy mean to you personally?
Well, I think we've talked about it over the last almost hour.
Well,
Right.
the Webster's dictionary has one meaning, and in terms of the history of the word, it,
Right.
it could have
Yeah.
been like meant like a messenger, or
Right.
for
So
royal families.
to me, legacy means what are you leaving for you to be remembered by?
Mm,
What is happening in the world in a good way? And you could leave a bad legacy too. But what for me, it's the synagogue. For me, it's my children. And these days, it's my clients being able to take what I've coached them, see the aha moment, and move on in their life.
brilliant, brilliant. So your faith, your work, your family, and I admire how much how serious you take it in the stewardship.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's a good way to put it. Stewardship. It's a responsibility that I don't take lightly.
It's lovely. It's beautiful. Oftentimes, legacies are built on values. So, if values are the legs of a chair, what three or four core values influence your legacy?
Oh, it's such a great question because I never understood values until I went through coach training. And once I did, I was able to look at my values and my ex-wife's values and realize we were never compatible. And maybe we shouldn't have got married. We had many, many good years, happy years. We have 4 great children, 8 grandchildren. I don't regret it.
I have to interrupt you for a moment. So, they say opposites attract because they make great babies.
Well, that kind of happened. That kind of worked for us. But for me, my values are honesty, communication, family, and humor. Now they're interchangeable. Now, I'm not saying which one is first, second, third, or fourth, but those are the top four. And community.
Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you for sharing that. Honesty, community, family, humor. How do you think you're living into these values today? And how
Oh,
would you go ahead? Go ahead.
every day, every day. I start my day thinking about my values, thinking about life, live incredibly full every day, life,
Okay.
gratitude, not looking for to complain, looking for the opportunities, saying how can I instead of I can't.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting with energy. Energy can either be destructive or it can be constructive, creative.
Agreed. I
Yeah.
believe energy attracts like energy.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting also that instead of like destroying your life, you're looking at it like it's artwork now, like
Yeah.
beautiful artwork.
Yeah. It's definitely a mosaic.
Yeah. But it's wonderful because your creativity is coming forth now.
Yes.
Yeah. And it is interesting. When it's like weddings or funerals always make us reevaluate life. And I almost wonder the passing of Michael when you were 10 years old, he was 5, if then it was an opportunity then to choose. And maybe you really came into choice when you were older. You know, they say that there's 2 dates in our life, the day that we're born and the day that we know why we're here and purpose. So I
Right.
almost wonder if that was, you talked about the situational depression and I think in that moment then it was like from the ashes you rose up
Yeah.
in that rite of passage because a lot of
Yeah.
times Americans unless they are in a draft there's not really a rite of passage. It's kind of like
Yeah.
life happens and then you got to figure out how to pull yourself up by your
Mhm.
bootstrings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for the audience that don't know that my situational depression came from me understanding a year into my losing everything that I was depressed, but it was situational.
Yeah.
It wasn't physiological. And it was up to me to change that.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
there's an interesting story in the book of Job. How much more, God? How much
There's a lot of
more?
interesting stories in the book of Job.
Yeah, I think he had situational depression perhaps in that moment. Okay, all right.
Probably.
If you were to set aside a weekend or two a month to design a hardcover coffee table book, what images, life
Wow.
or business lessons would be in it?
Yeah. Definitely there would be images of family, my children, my grandchildren, uh, being happy together. One of the things I that came out of my divorce was my kids would come to New York from New Jersey every other weekend. And being that we're Orthodox Jews, we don't travel on the Sabbath. They would come to my house and we would walk to my mom or to my sisters for dinner. And they said, Dad, we don't always want to go to grandma. We just want to sometimes hang. So I was like, well, I know how to cook a little bit, but if you don't mind my learning, I'll cook some more. I'll learn how to cook better. My ex-wife is an awesome cook. My mother, my sister's fantastic, fantastic cooks. And I've learned to love cooking. My ex-wife, my new wife, is a good cook, but hates cooking. She's corporate. She's very happy to go to work and coming home and dinner's on the table. I'm the cook. So there would be pictures of food and family. I believe that the way to a happy family is through food around the table, enjoying each other's company, enjoying the food. And for me, my contribution to that of them enjoying the food through the love I put into the cooking is a big part of that as well.
Yeah, the connection.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
on a regular basis to break the bread and to ask one another, how was your day?
Right. And
Yeah,
that's the beauty of Judaism, guys out there. We are forced to stop what we're doing on Saturdays, Friday night to Saturday night. The Sabbath, we don't use electronics, we don't use phones, no social media in a good way. we're forced to speak to each other, to enjoy each other's company. Tomorrow for lunch, we're all walking to my wife's parents with with her other sister siblings, and we're having lunch there.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, there's kind of a racy joke about Friday night.
Yeah, it's called mitzvah night.
Well, that and then that's when the wife gets worshipped, Yeah.
Yep, yep.
Yeah.
And it's called mitzvah night because that's the night you're supposed to, you know, do your best procreation.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, I'm glad you have a sense of humor because
Yeah.
some other things that because I prepared for today's conversation as I shared in our
Boy, oh boy, did you.
yeah, by going because some coaches and advisors are great in terms of what they call dancing in the moment. But yeah, that's not me. I need
All
to be
right. Wow.
prepared before I show up because sometimes, a part of the coaching experience is there will be curveballs that come up, but a lot of times I just don't want to walk into a room and not be prepared. So I
Right.
wrote down a couple of other things that I thought would be great for your hardcover coffee table book if I could offer them with an open hand.
Please.
Okay,
Please.
okay, good, good. I thought, in terms of life lessons, that you had an opportunity to transition from, feeling out of control in life by the pressure of business and borrowing money to learning to love yourself. I thought that
Mhm.
was really key because the number one thing that slows or stops a person down from designing their legacy is lack of self-worth.
Yes, absolutely. But a lot of that for me started with me understanding my emotional intelligence,
Mm,
right?
okay,
And understanding that I was for so many years allowing my emotions to control me instead of me controlling my emotions.
that's a great
Once that
distinction.
came into focus, the rest started to fall into place.
Very cool. Very cool. Something else that I wrote down is you had talked about the Four Agreements, a book that you were highly influenced by, and you had talked about this idea that particular author talks about, to not take anything personally, but the powerful question you had come up with was, are they attacking the issue compared to, my
To me.
identity in the conflict?
Right, right.
Yeah.
And because for me, most of my conversations were really confrontations because I was setting up for someone to come and attack me, right? Because that was me taking things personally.
Yeah. And you were
Once I
ready
started to
back
break it
then.
down and understand that, wait a minute, they may be having their own issues that they're putting on me. And that, the germ of that seed came from Don Miguel Ruiz and the Four Agreements and Don't Take It Personally.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the time you took today to share your journey, and I will be happy to put a link to your book if you send that to me.
Thank you. I made
Yeah,
it very simple. Just go to connectwithmartin.com. You can find all about me, my book, other things I have there.
wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, I,
Angelina,
I,
thank
I
you.
just want to take a moment that we had started out today's conversation regarding the intention of what if you are present, abundant, and mindful in designing your legacy. And I think we have fulfilled that promise today, that business promise in our podcast conversation regarding, your sharing that, how present you are today and that you found abundance, whether it was learning, um, you know, from the maximum of from every life experience. So whether, how you were shaped at age 10 to being able to understand that you felt this responsibility to grow the family name, you and Michael, and to, ways of communicating, whether it's proactive, whereas maybe before it was from that position of the defense mechanism, and also choosing consciously now, whether or not you'll make decisions as to what holds you back or propels you forward. So I very much appreciated you being a positive role model for today's platform.
Thank you so much, Angelina. You made it so easy for me. The way you number one, your research, your homework, unbelievable. Really, you are the most prepared I've ever met of somebody that I've had a podcast with. So kudos to you. Thank you so much. And you made the space such a comfortable space for me to share. So thank you for that.
It's my pleasure. I will I'll share with you that when I started the podcast a couple of years ago, I didn't know what I was doing. I just said I'm going to do the best that I can. And then the podcast reached the top 10%, and then it reached the top 5%. And I'm going, oh my goodness, there are people out there that are listening. And I think a part of it is, you had talked about this idea that you'll set aside the Sabbath to talk about a variety of issues and bring up family and tradition, etc. But there are many individuals that if their families are not talking about the idea of a legacy at their kitchen table, their dining room table, or holiday meals, where do they go?
Right.
Yeah, if
Right.
they go down
Exactly.
to the local coffee shop, Starbucks, Howard Schultz is not handing them a latte macchiato and asking, Martin, what would you like your legacy to be? So
Right.
I think that these days, and it's interesting because about two-thirds of today's affluent are self-made. So where do they go to get ideas of like, well, how do I design a legacy? Like you had shared, you understand values more because of your coach training, but
Yeah.
somebody that's done well in the tech world or cryptocurrency, they have no reference points for
No, no, they
legacy
don't. They
planning.
don't.
Yeah.
But it's so funny you brought up Harold Schultz because the other day I saw a clip of him talking to Congress and they were attacking him for being a billionaire. And he's like, but that's the American way. That's the American dream. He said, I was on subsidies when I was growing up. We had subsidies to pay. I'm not going to apologize for becoming what I'm supposed to become.
Mm, interesting. Well, I think the backbone of America is entrepreneurialism.
It is. It is. So,
Yeah.
I mean, he put her right in her place.
Yeah. I want to share one quick story about Howard before I read out my closing paragraph. It was during COVID, and I thought it was so interesting that there was an expectations for Starbucks to give back to the community. And I thought, well, isn't that something? Because Howard Schultz is a business person, and now he's expected almost to like play a political role of government. And I thought, isn't that interesting that when somebody comes into money and influence and a title or a position, they're expected to wear different hats. But what if they just don't know?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank goodness for people like Andrew Carnegie, who
Okay.
started that. He got to a point in his life, he said, I made enough. It's time for me to give back. And by the time he died, 80 to 90% of his money was given back in different ways.
The libraries and so forth. Very nice.
Yeah.
One more time, would you share your best website for a listener to get a hold of you?
Connectwithmartin.com.
Wonderful. In closing, I'm Angelina Carleton, the hostess of the Design Your Legacy podcast, as well as the founder of Legacy Planning, a boutique advisory firm based out of Beverly Hills, California, USA, but international in those I consult. I hope to dive deep into subjects that can help a person define, develop, and execute their legacy, and continue to scour the landscape for those who can be great resources to every dimension of your legacy. For many listeners, there can never be enough education and preparation in the mood or moat around your castle. Whether you find yourself a new wealth or generational wealth, may the content on this channel be an anchor in any storms ahead. We do our best to provide original content for your intellectual and emotional curiosity. If you're tuning in today on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or SoundCloud, etc., please remember to rate and review, share with your family and friends. And if you feel so led, send an email to either Martin or myself and share your thoughts and feelings about today's episode. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Martin, for speaking into your legacy.